Okay, so welcome to this session. It's a small but passionate, hardcore, dedicated group I can see here, right? Yeah? Okay, cool. So it's a really short kind of session, but it's something I'm really passionate about. I actually submitted 3 different topics to the organizers of this event for Casual Connect, and I'm really glad that they chose this one for me to actually talk on, so it should be some fun. So a little bit about myself. Okay. Just one slide as introduction. So I'm the CEO of Friendzu. We're a company, we're about 30 people, totally focused on mobile game development. We just do 3D games for women, so lifestyle games. And my day job is one of the 2 game designers at Friendzu. So we do a lot of stories. Stories are a pretty important part of what we do. And so I want to share kind of some great examples from the industry as well as what we've learned ourselves. But let me ask, and the topic of this presentation is that you matter, and you doesn't just mean the players, it also means you as the game developers who have the choice of whether to include story or not. So let me just ask by show of hands, who here is developing games, whether they're a programmer or designer or artist or anything? Okay, wow, nearly everyone. Is any publishers or? Nah, yeah. So, okay, you guys are interested in making hit games or just games that people love and that you love and you're proud of, right? So let me kind of dive in, first with a bit of history. Is anyone old enough to have grown up with this stuff? All right, cool. It was funny, when I was doing these slides, I was getting all nostalgic and looking at all these great books, and it was kind of cool, looking back now as a game designer and looking at how the branching and the stories work. If you're not familiar, these are kind of choose-your-own-adventure storybooks where you basically read and it tells you, if you decide to go in the cave door, turn to page 87. If you decide to retreat back to the town, go to page 92. And so interactive stories have been around forever, right? And this is not the first form. They've been around, since interaction has been around in language. Anyone grow up with this sort of stuff? Does anyone recognize? It's probably a bit hard to see. Like Baldur's Gate or some of those old traditional kind of RPGs, some hands as well, which are all being re-released on iPad, which is awesome. So you can kind of play all these classic games. Or back to the original kind of text adventure games. So Police Quest and Robin Hood and all of those original ones. So text used to be really big as part of gaming. So kind of what happened? So let's kind of flip back to today, 2014. So what went wrong, or what changed? And so let's take a look. So what about characters? Are characters dead? No. Characters are thriving, right? I mean, most of the top games, and you can come up with some exceptions, like 2048 has no characters. But most of the top games have characters. So, you've got the Candy Crush and your Clash of Clans and Flappy Bird and whatever else for these big kind of super popular games. Can anyone name these 3 characters? Of course, the one on the right, yeah, I think you can. But can anyone name the first and second character? Sorry? Yeah, no one really knows, right? So the characters, how they look and visual and move and animate is really thriving and popular. Everyone recognizes where these come from. But there is no storyline. So stories are dead, right? Is that the conclusion from this? And I think what the talk is about is that no, story games aren't dead. In fact, there's some very successful ones which are making quite a lot of money now. But the rules have changed. The challenges and what worked 5, 10 years ago is not working in the mobile free-to-play generation. So what are these challenges? Let's take a look at them. So there's a bunch of them, actually. So firstly, people now are playing in very, very short bursts. So we look at our stats, and we see on average that the average session length is 3 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, but lots and lots of them during the day. And it's not consistent, right? It's not like you're reading a book every night before you go to sleep. It could be you're playing 5 times one day, and then you wait for 5 days before you come back for another session. And it's the truth. People have shorter attention spans. You're competing with many more things in parallel that someone's doing. And they're not just playing your game, they're playing 6 or 7 other games in parallel at the same time. So a short attention spans. The other one is like, hey, text isn't that exciting. It's kind of like one-dimensional. It's not tactile. Mobile games are exciting. They're tactile, lots of effects. Then there's the issue of like, well, the graphics are becoming so good. So who here is making 2D games? Okay, it's about half, and the rest are doing 3D games? A few people, okay. So the graphics are getting better, whether 2D or 3D. It's really, really impressive. So that means there's less need for story. That's the one kind of point. And then the big one, which is like, hey, a lot of us are indies and we don't have much time or budget. How can we produce all of this content which is required for an interactive story game? And so these are all big, valid challenges for us. And there's plenty of others, like your traditional story structure of your hero's journey or your 3-act structure doesn't work in an environment where you need to grind, and you need to kind of keep on grinding and have infinite gameplay. So here are some of the challenges, and what I want to do is explain some of the different reference games and how they've attacked some of these different challenges, and let's draw some conclusions at the end. Okay, let's start with the bite-size chunks. So does anyone play Simpsons Tapped Out? Okay. I played for a little bit, but I've got some colleagues in the office who've been playing for, I think, close to 2 years now, and they're just totally addicted. Very, very few simulation games can last that long in mobile, but they've done a great job. They're not alone. A lot of people do this well now, which is they break up the text into very small chunks. So what's on the screen at one time is very, very small. But also, it's not just that, it's also the sequence, the story sequence. How long is it? So it's no good to go and take this big chapter of text and then break it into sentences and then just tap, tap, tap 1,000 times. You have to limit the sequence length as well. So they kind of do it really well. They have short chunks, and then they make them into sequences, and then they go and require gameplay to kind of access the next bunch. So bite-sized chunks is important. This is an example of one of our games, which is in development now and not kind of formally released yet. And what we found, so we put it through the beta and got a couple 100,000 users like playing it. And what we found is that we were killed by this at the start. We had a lot of text, like we wanted to set up the storylines, we wanted to set the background and the challenges and define their personalities. And people were bored, like it's too much text at the start. So the investment was too high at the start. And so we kind of took the conclusion, okay, let's reduce the text. And so we cut it down and made it bite-sized and really kind of restricted. And it's funny, like the new user experience is really good. But then later, once you get into the game, people are now complaining like, hey, there's not enough story, I want more. So it really, really depends on what phase of the game that they're in. But breaking it down, especially early, is important. The other thing is that what we found is that text by itself is really, can be enhanced a lot with character and character animation. So we put a lot of effort to kind of like match up the animations with what the line is trying to say and get the timing right for that. So what's interesting is like we actually used a higher poly avatar in these UIs just so we could go and get all the facial expressions, the depth of facial expressions needed to kind of like bring the text alive. And that really made a big difference. Like if we had the static images of the characters, then it didn't resonate as much. But when you had an animating avatar, expressing that emotion, whether it's like, excitement and optimism or whether it's fear, like that really counted. So if you have a character system, whether it's 2D or 3D, I'd highly encourage to kind of invest in aligning it to what words are spoken. Static images, I think, are a little bit, they're old. And I think there's better ways to do it, which are more dynamic. Yeah, so let's talk about the recall problem, because what we found is a lot of players would be complaining and saying, there's too many characters, I've forgotten what this quest is about, I've forgotten the story. And whereas maybe 5 years ago you were just playing one game at a time or one console game and you remember the story, you're in it every single day. So doing little things like adding the ability to replay the opening sequence to kind of get back, or a recap of where you are in the story is really useful. We added it for ourselves as a debug thing, so just so we could kind of debug the quests. And accidentally, we let it go out to one of our live builds, and then the feedback was really good. So people liked this replay option, and were like, oh, yeah, okay, I guess we should keep it. So do little things to kind of help, and realize that people are busy. They're playing tons of things, and they can't expect to know all of the characters. So I'm kind of a bit of a late reader now. I'm kind of catching up on Game of Thrones. I'm thinking about, the third book. And so many times I'm like, oh, who's that character again? I just forgot. So yeah, it's a game. You can be interactive. You can kind of give that reminder to them. The next one is like text is very one-dimensional and tactile. It needs to be tactile. Well, I think that it doesn't have to be one-dimensional. So we talked about animations. Here's a couple of really great examples. Device 6, which I highly recommend you kind of play these two games. Device 6 actually treats text as not just a one-direction linear thing, but it has text that goes in different directions. And you actually swipe and interact with the text to kind of unlock the next areas. And for example, if you're looking in a mirror, the text is actually reflected backwards, so you actually have to put your phone against a mirror to see what it says. And if you're going down some stairs, it will actually kind of, the words will kind of trail down. So it's a very interactive experience. It's not just a one-dimensional thing. Really, really good story. And the construct is pretty basic. Like it's like, you've woken up in this mysterious island, the kind of 60s setting, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. But the way they present it and make it interactive is great. Sorcery is a great one. I think it's a one-person developer, single developer, and basically has kind of like the action and the gameplay interacting with the story. So as you take actions, the story is actually generated. So it's kind of like this narrative that you interact with and you build as you take actions. So you can make it more interesting and alive. The next one is imagination. The old story of like, hey, the graphics are great, you don't need imagination, hence don't bother about stories, just show it through images. A picture is worth 1,000 words, blah, blah, blah. But hey, there's no rules here, right? I mean, there's no reason why you can't use imagination even in a visual game. So for example, High School Story, which is an awesome game and very successful as well, they do a lot of this. So they'll go and have a quest where it's all about vampires and what happened and so forth, but you're still looking at this kind of like map of the school, and what they're talking about is not related to that. But you've got the characters there, and you're in the kind of the mood of the characters, so it doesn't matter. You can use your imagination, and it actually works really well with the players. So feel free to mix it up. Don't feel like you're restricted to just what you have art assets for, that you can do story there. Like, do something totally different. It's funny, we did some mock-ups of a game we're doing which has a whole lot of like guys and girls kind of interacting together. And we actually did it where we had a blank screen and we just did the text. And people liked that better than the actual beautiful photos showing them where they were, because it kind of restricted their imagination too much. So yeah, play around with it. It can work. The key decision, especially if you're a smaller game maker, is what level of reuse, because it's costly to go and get writers to write hundreds of thousands of lines of words of text for a story. So what are some options to do it? Well, one is that you really just suck it up and just write a lot of text. So High School Story does this. They have half of their team are writers. So they have 16 people, engineers, designers, management, whoever, and half of them are writers. And they've done 300,000 words for this game, so a huge amount. So that's one way to do it, and it does work. Like, it's paid off in a big way. If you do go this approach, I highly recommend to test. So test with small amount of content. Get your first 10% in, get it out live, and if they want more, then you're on the right path. And we made this mistake a couple of times. We wrote like 30,000 lines, and it's like, oh, the style is wrong, or the pacing is a bit wrong. We have to throw it out and do it again. So test a lot. And I think this year we're going to do 500,000 lines in total in the studio, which is crazy. The other one you can do is to go and have replayability. So if you have branching in your story, let them go back and replay it. It doesn't work for all genres, but can work. Episode from Pocket Gems does that pretty well. And they also open it up to user-generated content. So they actually got their community to go and write stories, and then they bubbled it up the best content in the community and made it part of the game. So user-generated content can be stories, not just other traditional UGC things. I highly recommend if you're doing interaction to kind of like think in advance about the branching and restrict how many branches, because branches can turn into an n-squared problem, and you've got infinite amount of text that you need to write. So some solutions are the kind of classic string of pearls, where you go and have freedom within the pearl. So within the world, you can kind of do a lot of things, but then it converges back to a linear sequence to go to the next pearl. And we use that quite a lot in our games. Fake branching is good too, where you kind of give the illusion of branching and choice, but it's done through smart substitution. So it's like, oh, you want to go to the club. Okay, let's go to the club. It's going to be an awesome time. And oh, hey, look at the person who's standing there in the club. So you can kind of do fake branching. And if you do branch, unless it's like a major kind of parallel stream, reconverge pretty quickly. So in this example here is from one of our other kind of upcoming games, where the guy says, okay, do you even remember my name? I've never modeled before, how am I doing? And of course, my lovely, should I take off my sweater? So it's kind of like fun, the user has choice, but it reconverges like 2 slides after. So it doesn't get out of control. Because planning these things is a bit of a nightmare if you don't have any guidelines of how much branching and how to reconverge. And this is an example of the text variations that we use in one of our games. So I'll read it out, probably can't see it. So Avatar 1, it is I, Avatar 1 first name, famous for my show adjective 2, portrayal of show role 1 in the show type text, show name. So we just go crazy, and then the next slide is like phrase 1. So they have a sample phrase. So we may have like a hello, and then each character will have their own version of hello. Howdy, what's up, babe? So we kind of like have that kind of substitution, pretty extreme, but it lets us reuse it. So we reuse this text multiple times a day for some of the active players. And we also have something here on the bottom right. You can see the random. So we'll actually go and randomize what the conversation is about. So sports car owners, or we call it sports car stallions, or sports car connoisseurs, or sports car enthusiasts. So we kind of mix it up and make it more interesting if you're going to reuse. So I highly recommend. Some other approaches you can use is you can kind of use, and there's a really good talk, you can look it up, it's public. Ken Levine did a really good talk, and I was lucky enough to attend, talking about kind of narrative Lego, where you kind of like put these different story things together, and they kind of form blocks, and then they build the story by themselves. And this is based on a concept of kind of, you take actions, mini actions, and they're varied, and then based on that, your state changes, and based on the state and relationships between different people, then story triggers or it doesn't trigger. And so I can talk afterwards if you want to grab me and I can explain it. I think there's some interesting ideas and approaches in that. So how you can, with limited resources, get a game that, a text game that can kind of go and have the story that keeps on going and have grind elements in that. And then also I think there's an opportunity, I was just thinking about kind of what else can we do with story games going forward. I think there's tons of opportunity to go and combine mechanics. So for example, a story plus a gacha plus a craft, right? So you could imagine like a story tree, and you'd have story choice, story choice, story choice, and then it leads to a drop. It will drop something like a gacha mechanic. And then you could go back and craft it somewhere else, and then that could be used in somewhere else. Like it has a require function in another part of the story. So you can kind of mix the mechanics together, and that will introduce grind as well, which we need because you're going to run out of content if you just try to do a traditional story with branching and want it to last for a long time. If you're interested in this, I highly recommend to go and play with Twine. Do you guys use Twinery or have heard of Twine? Okay. Go to twinery.org. It's an open source kind of like interactive story tool, which lets you do branching, and it can programmatically customize variables and do all of this stuff without you having to build it yourself in the development teams. I think also the direction towards kind of like moods and having moods as a state and generating story from that and reactions is interesting. So Sims doesn't traditionally have any stories. You make your own stories in your head, but they have moods, and it's kind of automatically done. So we can go and evolve to generate stories, and happy to kind of share more references afterwards. So to finish up, in mobile free-to-play, there's a lot of unique and changed challenges, but I think there's ways to get around them. And my personal prediction, or what I'm seeing, is that we're kind of entering a new age, a kind of a renaissance of interactive story in mobile games. And I'm very happy to kind of help out, and if you guys want to contact me. My email address is simon@frenzoo.com,